Our thoughts on NFL Week 6 and something even more important. That is what we are talking about today on RotoViz Overtime. That thing that is even more important, Shawn, that we have to mention is it was one Shawn Siegele's birthday this past weekend. He told me before the show that he absolutely was crunching the tape over the last 24 hours. We've pretty much, I think, got the majority of games on deck here as Shawn's been digesting that film. I think, did you have some birthday cake, Shawn, followed by a real treat after of some extra game tape?
Well, the big ice cream cake, right? So that's about the most fun you can have dessert-wise. But for Sunday, get the full big dozen donuts. So you're eating lemon-filled, chocolate-filled. Get that apple fritter in there, some apple crumb. Colm, it was a very good day. Wonderful birthday. And then the games were fun. I was up till 2:25 last night watching them. And not because I necessarily had to get through them all last night, but I was pretty wired. It's hard to calm back down after you've watched the Detroit Lions play a football game and after you have watched Brock Bowers annihilate the NFL landscape. And this is going to sound like an incredibly foolish question, Colm, but when you think about Week 6 and how outside of Bijan Robinson, who hadn't been like that potent going into Week 6, it wasn't a huge week for the round one guys. I mean, several of them were fine. But if you were drafting right now in tight end premium, I mean, Brock Bowers is kind of moving toward the 101, right? Are there better players in tight end premium?
I would think that he would definitely be a top 6 pick. I think that would be where we would probably have him at the 101 shot. I think consensus would have him in the mid to late first round. Just getting the volume, getting the targets, getting the production. Has obviously everything we talked about coming in, as a prospect and is delivering already. And that was one of the things, not necessarily on Brock Bowers, but that I wanted to highlight again. We've mentioned this a couple of shows as we kick off, as to how things go. But Week 6 seen a lot of different things. There were some players, unfortunately, that got ruled out through injury. There was quite a few, fantasy relevant players, the likes of Chris Olave, who got ruled out through concussion early in that match. And there's a lot of things that can happen that affect your week to week NFL scoring for fantasy. But if we look back to last season, one of our big calls all off season last year, there was one being Sam Laporta, the second tight end that we were drafting a lot late that helped propel some of those teams to fantasy success was Trey McBride. And when we were managing this time last year, we were looking at a situation where, Zach Ertz was still there. He was, getting some targets, not a lot. But through 6 weeks last season, Shawn, Trey McBride had 12 receptions for 141 yards. And the reason I'm highlighting this is there's some players that haven't done a lot yet. There's some players who have just, getting back to health. We've had Chase Brown missing some games, for example, somebody that I would have drafted a lot of. As good as Worthy has been, there's been some conversation around, is it, enough on the thoughts that we had going in? But we look at players like Tyrone Tracy and how that game happened. We'll talk about that later. But, it's going to be very hard to put that toothpaste back in the tube after seeing what he was able to do on Sunday Night Football. We get Kamami Vidal getting some action, gets a long touchdown. You start to see players as the season goes on and the picture changes dramatically. That's why when people want to have the week 1 victory laps, the week 2 victory laps, the week 3 victory laps, the picture is only starting to get kind of done in pencil at this point. There's a lot of things that are, going to be hard to recover from if your team's, 0-5, for example, heading into this week. But he ended last season, you're on about the tight end 1 conversation. He started to cement himself in that area. And even this week where it wasn't a huge performance from him, still in tight end premium, very successful scoring. But he had 81 receptions at the end of the season for 825 yards, 3 touchdowns. The difference in some of these situations post and pre certain markings in the season. Last year, we had, the Chiefs bye week. Rashee Rice continued to break out after that. There's going to be a lot of things to change. So when we talk through these, and the reason I'm mentioning this when you mentioned Brock Bowers is the potential for his game now to continue to elevate as, I would expect that the offense should continue to improve rather than continue to struggle. But he's going to be at the center of that. I think Shawn will start with that game. We were going to start with the Lions. We'll go to that second. Brock Bowers has 9 receptions on 10 targets, 71 yards in this game. Could have been a bigger game. Did miss out a little bit of time through, I don't know if it was necessarily injury, but he was on the sideline in the third quarter. Aidan O'Connell starts this one. He goes 27 of 40 for 227, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Some struggles, some nice plays, all mixed in. We do have a couple of other parts of this game where, Justin Fields has the 2 rushing touchdowns, 59 yards rushing. I did put in my notes that it's pretty much a, offensive roller coaster sometimes when you're watching these plays from Justin Fields, in terms of there will be a play where you're like, well, that is, terrible. And then the next play, you're like, well, that is very, very good. And it's like up and down from play to play. But he had some good throws in this. The wide receivers outside of Pickens continue to struggle to get separation for him. But overall, I thought this was an interesting game, which the Steelers go ahead and win. But it could have been a different day with, Fields had a interception in this one that was overturned on a roughing the passer call. That led to his rushing touchdown on fourth down on that particular one. There was a couple of different times where the game could have swung in a very different direction, but it didn't, due to, it kind of went the way of the Steelers. So we also had a Madison touchdown overturned in this particular one. But looking through some of the performance, Shawn, I guess we'll stick to probably the Bowers side. What is the excitement level? Obviously, it was keeping you up to after 2 a.m. on this particular one. The last thing I want to highlight in this game is I never fully understand why coaches rush to the line of scrimmage when you're tackled at the 1 yard line rather than, let's see a replay and did he get in? Because in this situation, Madison gets to the goal line. It's not ruled a touchdown. It's ruled down at the 1. They run up, they rush the play, and it gets knocked out by TJ Watt for a fumble at the goal line. So that's another thing that kind of agitates me when I see it happening during games. But Shawn, Brock Bowers, tight end 101 for 2025. There is no ceiling?
There's a ceiling because you're playing for the Las Vegas Raiders, and probably Aidan O'Connell is a mild downgrade, specifically for fantasy purposes, from Gardner Minshew.
I don't
play okay in this game.
You think it's a downgrade?
I do. He doesn't have that Ryan Fitzpatrick element to him. He has that I'm a young QB kind of struggling to figure it out element, but without the sort of elite playmaking that we saw yesterday from Drake May and also from Spencer Rattler at some significant points. Now, the Rattler one sort of fell apart in the second half, but I mean, you'd love to see the quick release or the playmaking ability, something to that effect. Partly what's happening here with O'Connell is just that this team now is operating without any talent outside of Bowers. We know that Michael Mayer is out, in addition to the big names in Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers. With that being the case, you love to see him with all of the targets. I mean, Harrison Bryant, the kind of deep backup tight end, gets 5 targets in this game. Colm, on top of the 9 for 71, right? You're catching 9 of the 10 targets, even though overall O'Connell obviously isn't that good. But there's also an 18-yard catch going across the middle, the pass way behind him. He contorts his body, reaches back with one hand, grabs it, pulls it in. That one gets wiped out by penalty. It's not so much even that that's an extra 3.3 in tight end premium, although it is. But, I mean, that's yet another play that demonstrates just the freakish catch point ability for Bowers, in addition to everything he does, to get open with this ability to run routes and have the speed that makes it a difficult matchup for, a smaller defender, a difficult matchup for a larger defender. There's just really nothing you can do with him. But then after the catch as well, you have this elite ability with the ball in his hands to have that then offset with he's made a couple of catches this season already, Colm, that are pretty crazy. And you think about this one, 9 out of 10, obviously the ball not hitting the ground a lot when he is being targeted. And those are the three components that you're really looking for. And the advertisements we gave for Brock Bowers in the offseason were pretty crazy. So it would be difficult for him to be better than advertised. And yet, I mean, we're starting to move in that direction. But when you get as advertised, when the advertisements were pretty hyperbolic, and then you get the situation now, even with the Raiders, that was one of the questions. Will the Raiders knock down his value? Because A, you have Devontae Adams, and B, the offense may be terrible. I mean, it's never good when your coach comes into the season and says, we probably aren't going to score many points. That's not what you're looking for. If anything, you could argue that the Raiders offense has been slightly better than, you might have hoped, given the injuries that they have suffered and given the quarterback change, some of those types of, they're still pretty non-competitive when you put the whole package together. One of the things that happened in this game is that you get the fumbles from Amir Abdullah.
Yep.
You get the fumble, I believe, on the first career touch from Dylan Laube, which certainly a disappointing note for him. We like some things about Laube. He does eventually profile as a Rex Burkhead type of player. Yeah, anytime that you're your team's only weapon, you face concerns about increasingly gimmicky defenses to take that guy away. But man, it's been pretty extraordinary through 6 weeks.
Yeah, and I think I would hold the judgment maybe on the O'Connell thing. You may be completely spot on. The one thing I did like about him is he definitely was looking more towards the tight ends, mainly Brock Bowers in this one, whereas for Minshew, sometimes that wasn't necessarily the case. But that could just be completely down to game plan, and maybe the coaches thought that was more to O'Connell's skill set. But yeah, I think there's we've seen some very promising games from Bowers so far. Obviously, we've talked through them, but he's getting the targets and he's getting the receptions. There's been 2 games this year where he had 3 targets against the Browns and 4 targets against the Carolina Panthers. But outside of that, he's in that 9-10 range for targets. He did have 12 last week against the Denver Broncos. They are going to be trailing, I think, a lot this season, which is going to see him get a lot of usage. And he has only had the 1 touchdown so far this season. So when that starts to change as well, the Brock Bowers picture is very, very exciting. The other picture, Shawn, that was very exciting for Detroit Lions fans, obviously there is, one sad part of this contest being the fact that Aiden Hutchinson did suffer a leg fracture in this one on a sack of Dak Prescott that rules him out for the rest of the season, one of the best defensive players in the NFL. But the Detroit Lions, Shawn, absolutely whack the Dallas Cowboys 47-9. The Cowboys now 3-3 on the season. Interestingly enough, 0-3 at home. The Lions 4-1 on the season, coming off their bye weeks. And I mentioned about how teams are beat up after playing the Detroit Lions. This Cowboys team, it'll be interesting to see how they fare moving out of this contest. But the Lions coming off their bye week, they looked anything but beat up. They looked as fresh as could be. We had talked a little bit previously about how in some of the opening games of the season, maybe they weren't playing as aggressive as they were last year. There wasn't some of the same, maybe not swagger is the right word, but the way they were looking to beat up on opponents and get their best players involved. This one, we've seen them really try and punish the Cowboys. They were looking for hook and ladder plays to offensive linemen. They were looking for play action to some linemen. There was a lot of different things happening in this one. The Lions were not holding back. So 47 points they put up in this one. We get just the 4 targets for Jameson Williams, Shawn, but he does have 3 receptions, 76 yards and a touchdown. Sam Laporta only has the 1 reception in this one, but it's a 52-yard reception off a trick play. He goes into the end zone on that long run. As much as we, want to see Jahmyr Gibbs get as much work as we can, it's going to happen like this where week to week the touchdowns will get split up. Sometimes we get 2 short rushing touchdowns in this one for David Montgomery, who signed a new contract this past week. So there's lots of takeaways in this. I think that Williams looked good on what he was able to do. The interesting thing on his touchdown is the Lions are using so much motion on other plays, play action, trying to move people around. that was a play where, there's 15 seconds left on the clock, and I think the Cowboys are thinking that they're going to move somebody here, and they just snap the ball and they just go straight down for the deep touchdown. So that was another element on the game. He could have had a second touchdown in this as well, but it was ruled out for a Jahmyr Gibbs pick play. The Lions looked fantastic here, Shawn. The Cowboys looked dreadful. How much of that is on the Lions and how much of that is on the Cowboys? My takeaway is that this Cowboys team just isn't a very good team. On defense, they cannot stop the run. They've got run all over this season. They got run all over again in this 36 for 184 yards, 2 touchdowns on the ground, but they also give up 334 yards in the air for 3 touchdowns on 19 receptions. So they're really struggling defensively. Jared Goff has been very efficient, looks good, 315 passing yards, 3 touchdowns for him. So I just think they're in a really good place. Obviously, the injury to Hutchinson is a big blow, but I think they're primed, as are some of the other NFC North competitors that they have, to really battle it out at the top of the NFC come playoff time. But for fantasy football, there'll be some weeks where it could be a little bit quieter. The touchdowns kind of saved Laporta and Amon-Ra St. Brown's days in this one. But I think that it's a lot of fantasy goodness is going to keep coming the way here of the Lions.
This is playing out as an even more exaggerated version of what we had anticipated, where Amon-Ra was a difficult selection because of how many good players they had. They get him a touchdown late in this game. Now, late from the perspective of, this game being over in 3 quarters, over at halftime. But most of what you see here, as is the case, usually in these types of affairs, almost all of this happens in 3 quarters. They get him a score late to kind of pad his day. As you mentioned, only the 1 target there for Sam Laporta, but it goes for the long touchdown. And with Laporta on that run, and you see a couple things. First of all, you get the flea flicker action, which everything else you have to defend from the Lions, to have to defend flea flickers to a tight end as athletic as Sam Laporta, also, very unfair. But his extension on that touchdown at the end demonstrated A, the athleticism, and then B, just the intensity with which this team is playing. You could tell that they came into this game still with the memory of the questionable call at the end of last year that cost them, or potentially was one of the small elements that cost them the seed they were looking for in the NFC race. And basically they still came through, and if they don't play a terrible second half in the NFC Championship game, they play in the Super Bowl. Maybe they're the defending Super Bowl champions. They looked like the defending Super Bowl champions in this game. I don't recall, certainly an away team destroying a competent home team, because the Cowboys still have a lot of pieces. They just defeated what's really a pretty decent Pittsburgh Steelers team a week ago. And you still have Prescott, you still have CeeDee Lamb, you still have a number of those defensive players that led to the defensive performances last year. Now, one of the things that we've gotten from the Cowboys and from the defense is that this is sort of a front-running team, and this wasn't a game in which they could do much front-running. I think among the many things you're concerned about if you're a Cowboys fan, you think back to their playoff loss last season when they get blown out early by the Packers, but they put up a huge number of points, fantasy points in particular, in what is essentially a full game of garbage time. They're not able to do anything in this game. It was kind of strange that after what I would argue counted as a little bit of a breakout performance last week for Rico Dowdle, that they only give him the 5 carries. Now, in part, it seemed like once this game was out of hand, they were maybe protecting him a little bit. At the same time, he did play late. And so it's kind of this weird balance where if you're going to protect a player that you do think is important, why don't you hold him out entirely? But the Lions defense is maybe the most difficult to run on. And so one of the things we talked about in the Zero RB universe last week, that's going to be, play a role. You want to be aware of how some of these defensive matchups are going to manifest for your running backs. Here's who you can buy, here's who you can sell, all of those types of things. But the garbage time goodness that we expected for a player like Jake Ferguson, who just catches 3 for 11, Jalen Tolbert has a long pass go through his hands. Maybe he's looking back into the sun on that one, but you would love to get better than 4 for
Shawn, could we get some
him.
curtains? Could we get some curtains for inside that stadium? There's
kind
no
of a
doubt.
Weird deal, right?
There's multiple plays in that game that affected the Cowboys. Not saying the game would have been a different result, but that Tolbert one in particular, like you can barely see when you're watching it on TV. It's hard to see what's happening, but I can only imagine when they're playing. And there's a couple of pre-snap shots of Dak Prescott about to take a snap, and it's like, this is not ideal for playing football in. So I have also heard that when there's like concerts or anything on in the stadium, they do block that off. So I don't know why they're leaving it in there for an advantage, because it's not an advantage on game day. But yeah.
Well, on game day, you got to make things look good. I mean, it's all about presentation. For Jerry Jones and the Cowboys. Colm, the thought that I began and then interrupted myself on with talking about the Cowboys not getting garbage time. I don't know that we have witnessed what the Lions did yesterday. Certainly it doesn't happen very often. This is a team where even though the Minnesota Vikings are 5-0 and have been fantastic and deserve all the credit for that, even though you have some other teams like your Green Bay Packers, certainly you would expect the 49ers to very much get back into the mix. The Detroit Lions didn't just look like the best team in the NFC. They look like the best team in football. And it was kind of crazy how well Jared Goff is playing. And it's something that we leaned into a lot, especially in best ball. But, I mean, you can almost make the case that it's pretty frustrating that Jared Goff is kind of the way to have played this. Certainly, I think for a lot of people, it's a little bit frustrating that David Montgomery is the way to play this. And yet, those guys deserve a ton of credit. You talk about all of the run angry stuff with David Montgomery. There have been times in his career where he was more hype than substance. He's the biggest battering ram, hard-running player in the entire NFL right now. I would argue that what he's doing is better than peak Marshawn Lynch, because you have not elite speed, but you have a minor speed element with it as well. Or once he breaks some of these tackles, he can really go. He's not necessarily needed to be used in the passing game, but he's a good receiver. It is still a thing where once they hand off to Jahmyr Gibbs, he looks shot out of a cannon by comparison, and you're always waiting for Gibbs to have those massive, massive plays. But the combination of things that they can do in this offense, the fact that they don't even necessarily need to use Laporta, need to use St. Brown. Now, those players are very important in terms of what they're doing to the defense. You're not necessarily going to get Tim Patrick wide open for some of the plays he had in this game. Anytime that, Khalif Raymond and Tim Patrick are the 2 and 3 receivers from a yardage perspective, Raymond actually led the team in targets. Again, those are things that are going to be frustrating for fantasy managers. But the Lions' dominance is that when, you don't even necessarily take the guys away exactly, but try to, they have plays that answer all of those things. You mentioned Jameson Williams and the play that he could have had. That one, I think, was a little bit frustrating. It does end up in a field goal. It's not one that just somebody else got a touchdown. I don't know what Gibbs is doing other than trying to commit offensive pass interference, because they had Jameson Williams wide open for the touchdown on that play. All Gibbs has to do is not hold up a flag that says I'm flagrantly trying to commit offensive pass interference, and that play is going to work. That would have been a second touchdown for Williams. He had the long touchdown in this game, as you mentioned. He's just unbelievably fast. He also drops a crossing pattern where he lets the ball get into his chest. That's one of the things that obviously you have to worry about a little bit with him, that the Lions have to worry about. Not an elite catcher of the ball.
One of the
play might have gone for a touchdown.
Yeah.
I mean,
one of the positive things on that was, though, that the very next play, they went straight back to him again, which is obviously good to see, rather than, you dropped a pass. Well, we're going to, look elsewhere. But yeah, every time the ball comes near him in those areas when he's crossing across, you think there's probably one defender 15 yards away, and if he can beat him, he's gone to the end zone. So this also may have been kind of a little bit of game script in terms of the 25 pass attempts to 36 rush attempts, but I do think that the Lions do want to run the ball as much as possible. One of the things that I meant to mention when we were talking about, well, two things when we were talking about the Steelers game was I was watching these games kind of simultaneously, these two later games, and around the very same point, or within 10 minutes anyway, the Steelers had run that play action kind of flea flicker play that Samuel Porter scores the touchdown on. But rather than it turn out the way it did in this game, the way it's meant to be executed, nobody blocks the blocker. Justin Fields gets crushed from behind once he receives the ball back. So two very different versions of the same play. But Shawn,
do you remember who did the final lateral? Because there was almost like this little gleam in his eye where he's like, I should just hold this because
I think it was Pat Freiermuth. I'm pretty sure it was Freiermuth did the toss back.
As soon as Fields touches it, he's going to be crushed. You just have to hold that ball. You can't toss it back to him. But Freiermuth's like, well, he could probably take this hit.
Yeah.
You mentioned how Jekyll and Hyde it is watching Fields. He's just such an incredible playmaker. So much fun to watch. You could see the rushing ability in this one. He gets the 2 touchdowns, but also just flashes that long speed. I don't know what else he's supposed to do in an offense that's being coordinated by Arthur Smith. One of the things that jumps out every week when you read Blair's Wrong Read article, which again, anybody who's not, it's one of the all-time great pieces out there. I say that as a biased person, but man, it gets me ready for starting those, working through the start sits, working through everything I need to do on Sunday mornings. And it's such an interesting read. One of the things that, you don't even necessarily need all the fun advanced stats to see is that the Steelers lead the NFL in rushing despite being like the NFL's worst rushing team. So when you put those two things together, you're like, okay, well, our offense is going to be terrible because we handed off to Najee Harris a lot. Now Harris broke a couple of long plays.
That was actually the point that I wanted to make rather than the flea flicker play. But I thought Najee Harris looked really good in this game. I don't know if he'll go as far as really good, but I think he's looked good.
Well, there was one play where he kind of breaks into the open and he's made a nice move to get there. And then you're thinking back to his athletic numbers and you're thinking, okay, well, this is going to be a big play. And then he's caught from behind by a lineman. Well, he doesn't have speed, doesn't translate
he
here.
Doesn't have that.
But as you mentioned, he didn't get caught on one of his long runs. And as a result, this is a big fantasy day for him.
Yeah, he has a 36-yard rush in this one for a touchdown where he actually runs for 31 of those yards, Shawn. He jumps from the 5-yard line into the end zone and quite a play to make the effort. And that's one where if it's one of our favorites, if that's Jamar Chase, or not Jamar Chase, if that's Jamar Gibbs, we're saying, look at this guy making this play. I think that he's put some really hard runs behind an offensive line that is a little bit tricky to be behind. You see each time Fields gets the ball, he's like, how do I get out of here? Because the line.
Yeah, well, and we know Jalen Warren is one of the best backs in the NFL, and he had 6 carries for 7 yards because that's what Arthur Smith is setting you up to do.
Yeah, so I think Harris has done a lot. Just like if I was saying how it would go at the start of the season, he has surpassed any of the expectations I would have had for him. I have him on 0 rosters, and when I'm watching these games, he's looking quite strong. This was his better performance of the season, but I thought there was some nice plays. And there, Shawn, running backs that had nice plays throughout the week, there was a lot of people who stood out again. We'll have to give a reference to the likes of a Derrick Henry, who continues to do it. He had 25 points this week, but Sean Tucker has a surprising kind of breakout game for the Buccaneers, where he has 34 points, a couple of big plays in there. We had a nice day from Bucky Irving as well, who kind of led the bulk of the work in that offense. But both the Falcons running backs looking quite good again. Chuba Hubbard has continued in this same contest, Falcons versus the Panthers, to look pretty good, but not getting the work that's going to lead him, into RB1 category on a weekly basis. But now he's also going to face some competition with the rookie coming in as well with him. But in this game, Shawn, Tyler Allgeier, 18 for 105 and a touchdown. Bijan Robinson, you mentioned at the start of the show, 15 for 95 and 2. We don't want it to be a tandem. We've talked for a long time how good Allgeier is. We've talked about how Bijan Robinson has all the talent in the world. But as a 1-2 performance this week, those two guys absolutely tore it up. But they did face the Carolina Panthers, who are a team that you can tear it up against. Thoughts on the Falcons backfield moving forward?
Well, I think like you just said, it's no Shawn Tucker and Bucky Irving. Yeah, I mean, Allgeier is just so good. And that does create some challenges for Robinson, someone who has this pretty crazy lateral ability for a big back. And you can see all of the forced missed tackles. He is one of those guys who is up there near the top in evasion rate. I'm still looking for him to break some of these big plays. Now he averages over 6 yards per carry in this game. That part I think is encouraging. We'd like to see him have more in the receiving game. It was relatively concentrated if you want to look at it from that perspective, where London, Pitts, Mooney, and McLeod were the guys outside of the two running backs. Mooney has a bit of a letdown performance after his massive week in week 4. But Allgeier going over 100 rushing yards in this one. And, you know, again, we think about those toughness types of plays where a back actually does have the size, the leg strength to move a pile. In the contemporary NFL, you have all of these weird plays where someone gets stood up, but they're still churning their legs. Everybody comes in, hits the pile. He has a play somewhat like that, where he finally gets an offensive lineman to come hit kind of to the side of the pile and knock back the leverage a bit on these guys. But to get to that point, he had been stood up by like 6 guys and is still churning to the point where the officials are refusing to blow the whistle. He gets one teammate who comes in, knocks a little bit of these guys off of him a little bit, and then he like picks up the remaining 4 guys and carries them another 10 yards. And that's in addition to having good vision, having good burst, being a decent receiver. It's hard to make a back like that completely go away, especially when you get into some of these game scripts where you can go pretty run heavy once you get a lead. Andy Dalton did some fun things in this. Chuba Hubbard, again, looked very, very good. We finally got that performance we were looking for from Jatavian Sanders. It's not a huge game, but 5 for 49 is something that will definitely help you in some best ball formats. We have him quite a bit as a last round pick there. As you go through the buys, and certainly if you don't have some of the main players, and Colm, one of the reasons why this was such a fantastic fantasy week is that the 3 players that I am probably most heavily exposed to in FFPC and tight end premium formats are George Kittle, Trey McBride, Brock Bowers. Those 3 guys all had big performances. When you put that together, and in many cases, one of those 2 players is your flex player, then yeah, I mean, you're looking at this week as a very fun week. That's not going to happen every week. You do have some teams in there that, you know, maybe have a Dalton Kincaid. This was sort of a breakout performance for Mark Andrews, but you could have a Kyle Pitts. I mean, you could have a Sam Laporta situation where you need to have an additional guy in there. Certainly a lot of buys to still go, even though, as you mentioned, week 6 is one of those that for our particular portfolios was pretty heavy. I mean, Colm, to get through the week 6 buys with these types of scores, it was pretty stunning to me as I was putting the lineups together yesterday morning and then working through things in the evening. I did make a couple of pretty big blunders, like leaving Evan Ingram out on a team where if he had been in the flex, things would have much, much better. But overall, I mean, the teams look really good and really deep. And part of that are names like Bucky Irving and Chase Brown and Tyrone Tracy. Jatavian Sanders, one of those under the radar types of names where if you're looking for the next wave of things that you can do, you're trying to build out your roster. One of the things that I would note that I do often see in FFPC leagues is that maybe you'll have, 2, 3, 4 teams that are competitive in the league. Now, at this point, a lot of teams should still be there. That is one of the things that has been fun. You go in, you look at the standings, and in many leagues, 3/4 or 80% of the league is still very much alive because you have the points as well as the record. I mean, you can get a pretty bad run with record. You can still come back with multiple 180-point performances, right? But a lot of the teams outside of their starting lineup don't really have guys who could matter and are going to make a difference for you as you move through that bye week section and as you continue to suffer injuries. I mean, this was a week where you think about the buys, but it was another week where we had to play without Malik Neighbors. It was a week where you have to play without Nico Collins, and it's not going to be 1 week for Collins. Obviously, it's going to be a long time. So having guys like that and keeping track of the next player up. You mentioned Shawn Tucker. I think he's another one of those guys. You could have one-off performances like this if you are an explosive player like Tucker, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a star. He had a very rough start to last season. He did get a few opportunities when Rachaad White was playing so poorly, because for anyone who doesn't remember, Rachaad White's first 5 games last year were absolutely awful from a rushing perspective. He's putting up these massive negatives and fantasy points over expectation. You don't have evaded tackles. You don't have big plays. You don't have scoring. He emerges over the last 2/3 of the season, is very valuable as a receiver, becomes one of those actually pretty big fantasy winners as a result. But they tried to give Tucker a chance when White was struggling and he looked bad. This is the guy that we talked about last season. This is the guy that you saw at Syracuse. One of the problems that I think we potentially have now for Bucky Irving is that Shawn Tucker is almost certainly better. Now I say almost because, again, Irving immediately jumped him. Irving had some very nice plays in this game. Each of them has a 30-plus yard run. They both score touchdowns. It's a little bit fluky that Tucker also has a huge play in the receiving game that goes for a touchdown. But whereas Irving has this Barry Sanders-like ability to make guys miss in the hole, to beat a player at the second level, the other things are still true about him, where he's small and he's not that fast in a straight line. Shawn Tucker is short, but he is not small, and he is fast in a straight line. The thing that really jumps out here is you do kind of, I mean, I like the fact that Rachaad White had a good season last year, and in many ways. One of the reasons that we were off on him and said you have to have 100% Bucky, basically, especially in formats like redraft where you can move on if you're wrong, is that White's peripherals were below replacement level as a runner, and Irving is going to be a borderline star. So that's a pretty big contrast. I still like the fact that the Bucs have stuck with their former starter, but you see Tucker play in this game. And one of the problems for White when he's healthy is that he is the third best back. I do think it's still possible that Irving is better than Tucker. I think it's almost completely out of the question that Rachaad White is better. And again, you saw plus receiving from both guys in this game. There's not something that White brings to the table that the other running backs don't. And that's a small part of this blowout victory. Now, there were a ton of turnovers from the Saints, but Mayfield went a stretch where every possession he's throwing it to Tampa Bay, and yet they still score 51. They still win in the blowout. Colm, what was your experience of this game? This is one of the goofier, more fun games that we've seen. Also, I mean, Baker Mayfield is a straight up psycho. He injures himself throwing his body around. He goes to the sideline. They check him out. Like 3 plays later, he's 40 yards downfield, leading with his head, trying to throw a block to spring one of his guys. It doesn't seem like he's necessarily going to survive the season, but if you're a teammate, and Baker Mayfield is out there to play football, not to play quarterback.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Baker Mayfield loves to play football. This was a weird game when we look back through it. This was what, you mentioned Baker Mayfield a moment ago. I think you were highlighting that he was throwing the ball to the Saints rather than the Buccaneers, but he has 3 interceptions in this. We get 2 interceptions for Spencer Rattler. We get a fumble. I mentioned earlier, Chris Olave gets a concussion. On that hit, he does fumble the ball. And then that is a return touchdown for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It's 17-0 at the end of the first quarter. Then it's in terms of scoring in the second quarter. We get into halftime, though, Shawn, it's 27-24. There was like unanswered periods. I think it might have been 24-0 for the Buccaneers before it went to 27-24 to the New Orleans Saints. I may have this slightly out of order, but then the Buccaneers or the Saints don't score after that, and the Buccaneers put up 27 in the last 2 quarters. So a really up and down, wonky, kind of bizarre game. Obviously, Chris Olave going out is a big blow to the Saints offense. Rashid Shaheed had 7 targets, and this only had the 1 reception for 11 yards, but does have a return for a touchdown, kind of save his fantasy day a little bit. Kamara struggled on the ground. And this one, Shawn, Bob Means had 8 targets for 5 receptions, 41 yards, and a touchdown. It just felt like and I do think that, we're starting to see some of the deficiencies off the Saints offense, but they did still put up the 27 points. The interesting thing on the running backs that you're talking through there for Sean Tucker, Bucky, Irving, some people probably, I'm sure that we have long-term listeners who were listening last season. We were talking about Tucker coming in to the league, but he's only 22. It's not like this is like a journeyman who had a surprise 1 week play. It's going to be interesting to see now how the offense circulates around those 3 players in the weeks here that will follow. But he looked good. A couple of the plays, a little bit of the elemental luck to them, but also when you have 136 rushing yards on 14 attempts, it's very hard to talk that down. But they were explosive in the run game. The other player that
200 yards from scrimmage.
Yeah, he is 3 receptions on 3 targets for 56 and a touchdown. Mike Evans was in and out of this game a little bit, 6 targets, 2 receptions, 34. But the player that I want to highlight beyond that was Chris Godwin, 13 targets, 11 receptions, 125 and 2 touchdowns. Godwin has had, like a bounce back season. We've seen his time in Tampa Bay have some up and down years, but he's looking pretty much like a huge focus off this offense. And you mentioned Baker Mayfield being a psycho, but you mentioned with Aidan O'Connell, that kind of Brett Favre kind of let's rip the ball downfield and see what happens, or Fitzmagic. I do think there is a little bit of that to Baker Mayfield where he's going to keep throwing it. So that is looking pretty good here for Chris Godwin as well moving forward.
Yeah, Godwin looks great. He had mentioned in the offseason this was the first time that he really felt back after his serious knee injury. And I think there's a tendency, the players very frequently overstate where they are, overstate the differences or how much it's going to matter. It was something that caught my eye because Godwin, he's a former wide receiver 2 overall. And you look at some of the targets, you look at the ADOT over the last several seasons, you look at the role with Tom Brady, all of those things are a little bit disconcerting. Some people have a problem with where he's been from an open score perspective at times in his career. One of the things I would just note on that is that from a fantasy perspective, what you're looking for is the overall package and how a player's skills are going to translate into scoring fantasy points for you. Deebo Samuel, somebody else who had a big game this week, who often puts up poor numbers in both open score and catch score, right? So you're like, this guy doesn't get open and he can't catch the ball. How is he a superstar? Well, the things that he does well are more important, or within the context of what they do, they take advantage of his strengths. And one of the things, again, I don't think this is necessarily that controversial, but Blair has worked with these advanced ESPN numbers and demonstrated very clearly that it's the overall score that is the most important thing for you to keep in mind when you are looking at, how you not necessarily even beat fantasy, but when you are trying to determine what the skill level is, the quality level, what have you, of the player, and what that means in terms of where you want to put him ADP wise, or how you want to rank him and play that relative to ADP. Some of these guys who, have some red flags and have looked a little bit done, and from Deebo's perspective, for sure, you're getting some inconsistency right now. They can play. When Chris Godwin draws these targets, anybody when they draw the targets, right? But man, 125, the 2 touchdowns, he is completely back. And in many ways, he's easier to take advantage of week to week for the quarterback than Mike Evans is. And so depending on who's healthy, what the game plan is, what the matchups are, one of the things I do find very helpful to throw another little plug in is Dave Cabin's work and the passing matchup rater. That gives you a great feel for, even within an individual team, right? You can take the fantasy streaming tool and see what wide receiver group, running back group, quarterback group, what have you. But even within that group, the passing matchup rater will help you get ready for the week. That doesn't mean it's 100% accurate in terms of predicting the future. It's not what it's supposed to do. You're going to have some game plans occasionally from opposing defenses or just down weeks from players where they don't play as well. But when you're trying to make those difficult start set decisions, that to me has been, again, another sort of unique and very helpful tool. Colm, as we wrap up the first show of the week, maybe the most fun part of all of this, beyond having players that we like hit, was that week 6, following on what was a fantastic week 5, we're moving back into what a lot of us tend to think of as NFL football. I love to see the points go up. That doesn't mean that you don't have competitive defenses. It doesn't mean you don't have big hits. But this is what we're looking for. This is the real NFL. If you're a football fan, yesterday was one of the best days in a long time.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. One of the things I meant to mention as well when we were talking about the bye weeks is I felt heading into this week, kind of extra level of excitement, even though when you have like 60% Worthy in your best ball portfolio, you're kind of worried about how you do with him not in the lineups. But the teams that we build and the strategies we use, we're looking to like really start to take advantage from this point forward, building those super teams, being able to manage the bye weeks, being able to manage the injuries with the depth that you have on your rosters. And heading into this week, I was kind of like, this is where the teams start to take off. And then they did start to take off. And it's exciting to see now as we move into the rest of the buys, heading into week 7. The other thing, Shawn, just a fun side note, means nothing. The Cowboys got hammered. They did get 3 field goals. Brandon Aubrey, when he put over his first field goal yesterday, something that caught my ear was that the announcer said that he now has over, I'm going to let you guess the number, how many yards of field goals. That was the first one he put over yesterday. I haven't added on the other 2, but over how many yards at that point on the season, 6 weeks in, field goals?
2,000.
Shawn, come on.
What's
700.
700. I'm not calibrated on field goal distance. I do have.
It does feel like 2,000.
Albrecht portfolio. I mean, he's scoring like a quarterback.
Oh yeah,
right. It's the thing with him too, and maybe this isn't that different than a lot of the other guys. But on one of his 50-yard field goals yesterday, I honestly thought they had blown the whistle because it didn't look like he had even tried, and he kicked it like 60 yards straight down the middle. Yeah, so he's it was a real play. He was trying, so not that impressive necessarily. He very easily swings that leg, man. He's good. I mean, you can celebrate all the different positions. Brandon is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, he got all the Cowboys points yesterday in terms of on the field, but it is good to celebrate different positions. It's a wild start to the season for what he has been able to put up. But that is going to do it for this edition of RotoViz Overtime. We are going to come back a Wednesday edition where we talk through the remaining games from NFL Week 6. Some interesting notes to go through those as well. Make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed. Get all the shows once they are available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. He did mention Blair's work and the rest of the team. Lots of great stuff on there. Some of the stats that we talk about during shows will be up on the tools on the website, so check those out as well. And until we are back, have a good one.